naturally inspired by the angels. There's something divine about their ilham, about their inspiration. And if there's anyone in my ummah like that, it's Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And one of the explanations of that, تَتَكَلَّمَ الْمَلَائِكَةُ عَلَى لِسَانِهِ, it's as if the angels are speaking on his tongue. SubhanAllah, imagine a human being that is so in tune with righteousness, with the good part of their souls, with the obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that when they speak, they are so divinely pushed towards good naturally because of what they are seeking, that it's as if the angels are speaking on their tongue. And that is why with Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he was so divinely inspired because of the amount of angels he invited around him, that it was as if angels were speaking on his tongue. And indeed, there would come times where Jibreel alayhi salam brings the revelation from the heavens in the form of Quran, and the wahi agrees with the ilham of Umar. The revelation agrees with the inspiration of Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu. Because the one who sends Jibreel alayhi salam surrounds Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu with angels, and Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu is inspired towards righteousness, and Umar radiallahu anhu is committed towards righteousness, and that gives him perception and gives him an environment where when you're interacting with this human being of Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, you're interacting with a man that is surrounded by and has within him angels, right, that are inspiring him towards good. And that's why when you read the narration of Umar radiallahu anhu calling out to Sariya, miles and miles away, thousands of miles away, hearing something, seeing something miles away, that a miracle like that is given to Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, because as some of the ulama mentioned, the angels caused his voice to be heard in those places that were so far away. And that is not something that was randomly given to Umar radiallahu anhu, just like none of these Sahaba randomly achieved these things, but that is something due to his sincere pursuit of truth. When you sincerely pursue truth, then you are surrounded by the soldiers of truth, and they are the angels of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Every one of the four khulafa has a connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and an interaction with the angels that fits exactly what they are famous for. So with Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he is as-Siddiq. The highest name that you could be written with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with is as-Siddiq, right? And there's even a hadith, حَتَّى يُكْتَبَ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ صِدِّيقٌ, that a person continues to tell the truth and do the actions of truth until they're written with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a person of truth. So this name comes down from Jibreel alayhi salam to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and this is what he's known by. And Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu is a celebrity of sorts amongst the angels, right? On the Day of Judgment, they're all calling him to their gate of Jannah. And Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu is the one who's in touch with the truth, right? The one who, subhanAllah, is speaking to the angels, and the angels speak through him in regards to his judgment, in regards to his perception, because the shayateen would be nowhere around him. And then Ali radiallahu anhu, right? Who is a man of courage, bravery, who is so courageous and so dedicated and relentless in his dedication that he would be blessed with Jibreel alayhi salam and Mikael alayhi salam next to him as he goes forth carrying the banner of Islam. Now with Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu, there is something very special about Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu, because usually we talk about the angels inspiring goodness in us, meaning the angels in our presence change our demeanor. In the case of Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu, this man reached such a level that he changed the demeanor of the angels, and that's not known with anybody else. And this goes back to a famous story with the Prophet ﷺ with Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu, that Aisha radiallahu anha narrates that the Prophet ﷺ was sitting at home, and as Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu came to visit the Prophet ﷺ, he was reclined. And so his leg was a little bit exposed. The Prophet ﷺ was in a relaxed state. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu came in. The house kind of stayed as it was. He sat with the Prophet ﷺ for some time. He asked the Prophet ﷺ when he had to ask him, and then he left. Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu came in, as the order always is, and the same thing happened. The Prophet ﷺ remained in his place, and the house remained as it was, and Umar radiallahu anhu asked what he had to ask, and then he left when he got what he wanted. And then Uthman radiallahu anhu came. And Aisha radiallahu anha says the strangest thing happens, that the Prophet ﷺ suddenly starts to say, fix up the house, put the blanket here, and he sits up alayhi salatu wasalam and he fixes his garments. And Uthman radiallahu anhu comes in and the Prophet ﷺ receives him in a very unique and special way. Now Aisha radiallahu anha is watching this, and when Uthman leaves, she says, I was very curious. We know the status of Abu Bakr. We know the status of Umar. Why did the Prophet ﷺ act this way with Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu? I asked the Prophet ﷺ, Ya Rasulullah, Abu Bakr came in, Umar came in. You didn't do what you did when Uthman came in. And the Prophet ﷺ said, Ala astahi mimman yastahi minhu al-malaika? Should I not be shy of someone whom the angels are shy from? Should I not be shy from someone whom the angels are shy from? Even the angels have haya around Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu. So subhanAllah, Uthman changes the demeanor of the Prophet ﷺ, the best of all creation, and he changes the demeanor of the angels by just being who he is. Now, let's break this down, because most people have heard this hadith about Uthman radiallahu anhu, but there is wisdom to it. Number one, Uthman radiallahu anhu, we know, is Dhun Nurayn. He is the possessor of two lights. Someone who was so beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed him by sending Jibreel alayhi salam to command the Prophet ﷺ to marry not one, but two of his daughters to Uthman, right? So when Ruqayya radiallahu anha passes away, the Prophet ﷺ receives a command through Jibreel alayhi salam to marry Kulthum radiallahu anha to Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu as well. So he's the possessor of two lights. But think about all the ahadith about what the angels praise a man for, and compare that to Uthman radiallahu anhu. Uthman is known for his lengthy recitation of the Quran, finishing an entire khatam in one rak'ah, right? Amongst those who it is said that he would read the Quran more than once a day sometimes, the entirety of the Quran. And he said, if the hearts are in a good place with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then they are never full of the recitation of the Quran. They never get to a point where they're tired or they feel like they've reached their fill from the recitation of the Quran. He loves the Quran, so he recites the Quran constantly. Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu is the man who comes forth with sadaqah that is unparalleled, with charity that's unparalleled. So when you think about the angels that descend for the Quran, the angels that descend for sadaqah, right, for charity, crying out, Allahumma a'ti munfiqan khalafa, that, oh Allah, give to the one who gave, and oh Allah, withhold from the one who withheld. Think about Uthman radiallahu anhu coming forth every single time the Prophet ﷺ asks for anything. And the Prophet ﷺ holding the coins of Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu and saying, nothing will harm Uthman radiallahu anhu after what he did today. But there's a particular trait, al-haya, the concept of shyness, the concept of bashfulness. And there are multiple narrations about this concept of haya. The Prophet ﷺ mentioned al-haya min al-iman. Bashfulness is from faith. It's a form of iman. The Prophet ﷺ said, al-haya la ya'ti illa bi khair. That anything that comes through haya, through this concept of modesty and shyness and bashfulness, anything that comes through it is good. Al-haya khayrun kullu. Haya is all good. It is the main characteristic of Islam, and Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu embodied haya. Now, what makes it so impressive with Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu that he was so shy? First of all, his shyness was in public and in private. And it was with his family and it was with the community. And more than all of that, it was with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He had a shyness to sin, a shyness to do anything that would be displeasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He had this modesty, this humility, this shyness that he carried throughout every facet of life. But the thing that makes it even more impressive is that Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu had every reason to not be shy. Okay? You think about the things that make people a little arrogant, that make people a little boastful, that cause people to degrade others. Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu had beauty. Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu had wealth. Uthman radiallahu anhu had the look, he had the wealth, he had the clothes, he had the status in society. And with all of that, Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu was the most humble and shy person that you would meet. And the ulama say, subhanAllah, the haya of the malaika with Uthman is not that they would be shy to be in his presence. No, it's that they longed for his presence, but that their demeanor changed in the presence of Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And they were shy in his presence, including Jibreel alayhi salam. And part of that was what? They said, Ya Rasulullah, a man that will be killed by his people. Despite all this goodness that he does for the people, the shyness of Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu is a contributing factor to his assassination, because he refused to use his position with the people or his previous good deeds to enforce authority over the people. Uthman radiallahu anhu instead held back. And so the angels, knowing what is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu, also caused them to have a shyness in his presence radiallahu ta'ala anhu. This is one of those narrations where you have an unknown companion, but clear instructions that we can benefit from as an ummah of the Prophet ﷺ. So the first narration is actually Muslim Imam Ahmad. It's an authentic narration that there's this man who was looking at the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ was standing and speaking to another man for a very, very long time. And he said that the Prophet ﷺ was occupied by this conversation to the point that I started to feel sorry for him, right? So the Prophet ﷺ is a busy man and he gets stopped all the time. You can imagine how many people want to talk to him, alayhi salatu wassalam. So he said, أشفقت عليه من طول قيامه معه. I felt sorry for the Prophet ﷺ because of how long he had to stand and talk to this man. So eventually, I waited for the Prophet ﷺ, and the Rasulullah ﷺ came, and I said, Ya Rasulullah, who was that man that was talking to you? Because I felt sorry for you, for how long you had to stand with him. And the Prophet ﷺ says, did you see him? And I said, yes. So the Prophet ﷺ said, ذاك جبريل. That was Jibreel alayhi salam. قال ولو سلمت عليه لرد عليك السلام. He said, if you would have come to him and said salam, he would have actually answered your salam. So it was a missed opportunity for you to come to him and say salam. And then he said, ما زال يوصليني بالجار حتى ظننت أنه سيورثه. He said, Jibreel alayhi salam kept on coming to me and telling me, take care of the neighbor, take care of the neighbor, take care of the neighbor, until I thought that he was going to assign inheritance to the neighbor. Now, why do I start with that narration? It actually precedes a chapter in the book Al-Adab Al-Mufrad by Imam Al-Bukhari, rahimahullah ta'ala. Imam Bukhari, of course, Sahih Al-Bukhari has the most authentic ahadith from Imam Al-Bukhari, rahimahullah ta'ala. Al-Adab Al-Mufrad are some of the mannerisms and etiquettes that we can learn, and there's some ahadith that he includes there that might have a weakness in the chain. So this chapter is called Bab Shikayat Al-Jar, the chapter of Shikayat Al-Jar, the complaint of the neighbor. And it's narrated by Jabir radiallahu ta'ala anhu that this man comes to the Prophet ﷺ to complain to him about how he is being mistreated by his neighbor. And while he's sitting between al-rukun wal-maqam, the Prophet ﷺ is between the rukun and the maqam, this man approaches the Prophet ﷺ and he sees that the Prophet ﷺ is with a man who's wearing a white garment. And he mentions the beauty of this man and the fact that, this man seemed completely unknown and out of place. So he said they went to the maqam where they were praying upon the dead. And he said, I asked the Prophet ﷺ, I said, Ya Rasulullah, may my mother and my father be sacrificed for you. Who was this man that was with you? And the Prophet ﷺ says, did you see him? He said, yes. He said, رَأَيْتَ خَيْرًا كَثِيرًا. Then you have seen much good. And he said, that was Jibreel alayhi salam coming to me. And he said, he kept on speaking to me about the importance of the neighbors until I thought that Jibreel alayhi salam was going to command me to assign inheritance to the neighbors. So subhanAllah, in both of these incidents, and they could indeed be the same incident, you have a situation where the Prophet ﷺ is talking to Jibreel alayhi salam for a long time, and Jibreel alayhi salam keeps on saying, Al-Jar, 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 the neighbor, the neighbor, the neighbor. Be careful with the mistreatment of the neighbor. Warn the ummah about the way that the neighbors are supposed to be treated. And you know that famous story of the woman that used to pray a lot, and she used to fast a lot, and she used to give a lot of sadaqah, but she had an abusive tongue towards her neighbor, right? All of these ahadith, all of these narrations are coming from a place. And there's a spirit that is often lost in our discourse today because The emphasis on the neighbor is not really there. And that's something that even the Sahaba, they took from the Prophet ﷺ, and they didn't just take it with one another. There's a beautiful narration in Abu Dawood that's an authentic narration that Mujahid rahimahullah says that Abdullah ibn Amr radiyallahu ta'ala anhuma, and we know who he is, he sacrificed a sheep. And as soon as it was sacrificed, before they could start to, take the portions of it, he said, "Have you given some of it to my Jewish neighbor?" SubhanAllah, he's sitting amongst Sahaba, he's sitting amongst Tabi'een. What do you mean, my Jewish neighbor? He said, "Have you given some of it to my Jewish neighbor? For I heard the Prophet ﷺ say, Jibreel alayhi salam kept on coming to me and talking to me about the neighbor, until I thought that Jibreel alayhi salam was going to make the neighbor an inheritor." And so we learn from this, subhanAllah, that, if we could listen in on some of these conversations, that much of the conversations we would be able to witness and see from the Prophet ﷺ and Jibreel alayhi salam would actually be about us, with an issue that, while it is not at the forefront today, is still very much important to us, even if our neighbors are not Muslim, as was the case of Abdullah ibn Amr radiyallahu ta'ala anhuma.